Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
Today, we're going to take the conversation in a slightly different direction, and a direction that I myself personally am really connected to. And this is a direction which focuses really on the question of what it is that we're doing as radicals, right? As anarchists, as, sort of fellow travelers, like what is it that we are doing in the world, and how is it that we understand what we're doing? I think that right now there's a lot of open conversation about rethinking revolutionary thought that's incredibly productive. And so I want to try and push a conversation a little bit in that direction. So do you want to just jump in and maybe introduce yourself real quick, talk about some of the stuff you're working on, things that you're interested in, those kinds of things?
Yeah, sure. Hey, so first off, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be on the show, especially so early in its youth. I'm really honored that you've chosen to invite me. My name's Adam Greenfield. As you can hear from my voice, I am a New Yorker, but I've been resident in London for the last 10 years. And I've got a really mixed background, but most recently, I spent about 25 years in technology and looking particularly at the ways in which technology intersects with design, intersects with politics, and intersects with everyday urban life. And it has taught me a great deal. I mean, I'm really chastened by that experience in a lot of ways. And I've come out the other side of it with all of my utopianism stripped away, fallen to my feet.
As the tech industry does.
Yeah. I mean, really, if you want a place where dreams go to die, it's that entire sector. We can get into that later. And with my dreams and ashes around my feet, but what I'm left with is optimism. And this is definitely one of those pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will sorts of situations. But it is where I am. And so what I've been working on lately is A, how to undo all the damage that I felt that I did in the course of my time in the technology sector, and B, specifically how to undo that is in helping myself and others forge more productive ties with one another at the local level in a way that does an end run around a lot of the political discourse that we're fed in ordinary mainstream society, that lets us get to the root of some of the major issues that we're contending with, most primarily, of course, climate system collapse. So to put it in a nutshell, how do we get together with one another? How do we organize ourselves as individuals, as communities, to survive the thing that's coming at us, and to do so with a modicum of grace and dignity and with our values of justice and equity and freedom intact? How do we do any of that? That's what I've been working on for a while.
Yeah. And so, I obviously you've written a lot on like smart cities and stuff. I think I want to focus on your recent texts on Lifehouse very specifically, and maybe get into, maybe if you could kind of walk people through like how that text came about. Like you talk about it in the book a lot, and it's a fascinating story, but sort of how someone who had been writing about smart cities and working in tech and doing tech things all of a sudden had this kind of formative shift in experience. Like what was the process of bringing that text up, and like why were you interested in writing it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that even in technology, I was trying to extend a lineage of thought and action that even at the time I got interested in technology was already dying and has since just been, I think, intentionally extirpated. There was a line of idealism is accurate, but it doesn't even convey the sense of what I'm talking about. I mean, we're talking about going back to the Whole Earth catalog or a pattern language. I mean, there were real left libertarian currents of thought that expressed themselves through individual and collective empowerment through the tools that we had access to at the time. And I was very deliberately trying to keep that tradition alive and to extend that tradition in contemporary network digital information technology. So it isn't like I was this, typical Silicon Valley tech bro who had an epiphany one day and decided to become an anarchist. It was more like this was a natural evolution of beliefs and tendencies that had always been part of what I was trying to realize and actualize in the world. And frankly, just failed in actualizing. The critical point, the nodal point, the inciting incident, as my partner would say, she's a documentary filmmaker, and so she always talks about inciting incidents, is Occupy Sandy. And I realize now that we are 12 and some years downstream from that, that all of a sudden I'm finding, it's crazy. It kind of puts the zap on your head. Yeah. I'm finding that I have to kind of explain to a lot of people not merely what Superstorm Sandy was, but what Occupy Sandy was and why it came into existence and how it came into existence. So for the benefit of those of your listeners who, might not have been, out of diapers when this all happened, in the fall of 2012 in New York City, where I was living at the time, there was an extraordinary weather event. It was something that was fairly unprecedented. It was a large Atlantic hurricane very late in the season, and a continental cold front that in itself was just, outscale. And these forged in the atmosphere over the northeastern United States and made landfall on New York City in the fall of 2012 and brought the city to its knees. I mean, it was like nothing that anybody had experienced in the city's living memory. Infrastructures, all of the infrastructures that support us in our desire to kind of keep on living everyday life, all of that just came down in splinters. And in some of the more affected neighborhoods, those infrastructures stayed down for weeks. And it really left hundreds of thousands to millions of people at very real risk for their lives in some cases, and with just absolutely serious, consequential risk to their health, their body, and their ability to go on existing. The good news in all of this was that within 24 hours of the storm making landfall on New York, there was a response. There was a very robust response that had already opened up 2 disaster relief and recovery hubs within, 36 hours or so. We're serving tens of thousands of meals out of those hubs, was operating in every neighborhood that was affected, was getting out to the hardest hit communities, was getting relief supplies out to people, and was really pulling people out of some really dangerous situations. And I'm always at pains to stress that this organization wasn't the government, and it wasn't anything in the philanthropic or charitable sector. It wasn't the Red Cross, which, Americans generally think of, or at least used to think of, as being sort of the prime protagonist of events like this. It was a consciously anarchist, avowedly mutual aid organized, self-organized initiative that was put together by people who had come through Occupy Wall Street the year before. These were people who retained their networks, stayed in touch with folks all through a year in which it seemed like Occupy Wall Street had pretty much played itself out and was no longer a force in American life. And when the storm made landfall, all of a sudden they were able to stand those networks up, begin directing supplies towards these relief hubs, and really generate an extraordinarily impressive mutual aid effort that, as I say, really helped anywhere from hundreds of thousands to maybe even millions of people get through the storm together. To me, that experience, I always say the role that I played in Occupy Sandy was very small. It was literally merely shifting boxes, being part of human chains that were bringing parcels in off delivery trucks and sorting them into the pews of the church that we had kind of appropriated as a relief hub. My role in Occupy Sandy was not that of a theorist. It was not that of a strategist. It was literally just a pair of hands, and not even for very long at that. I mean, I think in my calendar, there are 12 days that I was a part of this. So we're not talking about, a huge commitment on my time, but it transformed utterly my sense of the possible. It transformed my sense of what it was legitimate to ask for from people, from communities, what it was legitimate to expect of people. And really the question I began to ask myself after the success of this initiative was, my God, why don't we organize more of our lives like this more of the time? I mean, it's right there for the taking. And that is the question that I basically kept close to my heart to this day. Why is it that we don't organize more of our lives like this more of the time? Can we? Is the space available for us? Can we claim that space? How do we make that happen together? How do we overcome the very real forces that are trying to prevent that from happening? And can we together forge a trajectory through all of the stuff that's already fallen upon us, will continue to fall on us, and will determine most of the rest of our lives on Earth? Can we forge a pathway through that responds more to the values of the politics that I hold so very dear, and it sounds to me like you share?
Yeah.
How can we do that? Can we do that? And in what ways can we learn from places and times in the past that people have done that, and maybe glean a thing or two from them and pick up some tips and some tricks and see if we can't do it for ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of threads in what you just said. I want to mark a couple for people to kind of take a look at so we don't end up getting sidetracked on them, because they themselves are whole conversations. But, you'd mentioned like the Whole Earth catalog and the early kind of techno-utopianism that came out of the hippie community. It's a really fascinating story if people really want to dive into it, because that circle of people ended up creating the Electronic Frontier Foundation, right? John Perry Barlow, who was a songwriter for the Grateful Dead, was the founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, right? So like those, and there's a lot of complicated reasons why they moved into kind of a techno-utopian space as opposed to a like physical activism space. And like there's a lot of story behind that, but one of the things that comes up in that story is this very specific incident in which a crew of hackers from New York, and this is early hacker scene, so they were still like dumpster diving and like picking locks and breaking into offices and stuff like this, got onto the Well, which was the Whole Earth Electronic Link. It was like one of the first bulletin boards. And they started arguing with John Perry Barlow about how what was happening wasn't this super liberatory thing, that it had these elements, but that it was also deeply tied in with capitalism and the state. And he said, well, I don't buy that. And so they hacked into TRW and stole his credit record and doxed him on the internet to prove that TRW had been gathering all this information about people without anybody knowing it, right? So that's a whole really fascinating story, and that's a whole conversation, as someone myself who kind of comes out of the hacker scene, that's a whole conversation in itself. There's also another thing you bring up about the importance of learning movement history, which I really want to encourage people to do. I mean, Occupy Sandy was 12 years ago, right? The anti-war movement was 20 years ago. Seattle was 25 years ago. And like, those are the roots of what we have today. And so for those of you that are getting involved with this stuff now, really like go back and read those histories, talk to the people that are in their 40s and 50s that have been around this whole time, because it'll really help you understand the depth of the thought and the experience and the drive and the energy that has gone into these kinds of things over a couple of decades. And so
yeah. And you make a great point. Sorry to interrupt, but like I gotta say that, like, so I'm 56 years old. And I still feel quite, young and involved and vigorous. But it occurs to me that just through the passage of time, I've become kind of an old head, like that was like the old heads that I remember who had been through the post 68 moment, right? Like they had been in Chicago in 68. They grew up in Panther schools, or, they were members of various, anarchist and anarchist inflected movements in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And, I always thought that once they had established certain beachheads in popular culture, that we wouldn't need to fight those same battles. Yeah. And what I've seen in my time, sadly, is that you kind of, there's no permanent victory, and you have to kind of reestablish each of the achievements that was won in a new time and a new place with new protagonists, right? Yeah. With people who, and if you do have our kind of politics, especially what this means is that you can't rest on your laurels, because they might have achieved opening up some kind of liberatory space for technically savvy white male privileged programmers, with a particular kind of access to technology, right. And because of the mediation that we had at the time, we might have regarded that as sort of movement history. And I'm not saying it's not movement history, but it was incomplete.
Yes. Yeah.
Even as an achievement, it was radically incomplete. And so I'm both humbled and kind of awed, in a sense, by the responsibility that now falls on the shoulders of people who have lived through the transition from pre-Seattle to post-Seattle.
Yeah.
We now live in a world in which horizontal organization, as you say, is sort of de rigueur. This is just the way we do things. It was not always that way.
No, that was not that way when I got involved in the early 2000s even. Like at all. It was still hierarchical coalitions and liberal organizations with their steering committees and like all of that. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So tell me more about, like, for you, how did that wave crash against you? How did you find your way into horizontal organizing?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, as you were talking, I was going to mention a thing which just kind of came across my Signal feed from a friend today who works at a book warehouse and had come across a box full of old radical newspapers from the early 1970s, one of which my mom worked on.
Oh.
Right. And so you get this, like, there's like this lineage. And what's funny about it in that context is like there's this statement that my friend took a picture of about how, all these people playing these like games of ideology are really playing these like power games. And really what they need to do is they need to not play power games. They need to bring politics back down to life. And it's like so similar to the conversations we're having today. Right. Like it's so similar. But yeah, I mean,
that's a little painful.
Yeah, like my trajectory was, I was lucky. To put it mildly, I was lucky. I came up in a city with a strong political history, in a family with a strong political history, in the Rust Belt, in a time when everything was collapsing. And so like my whole life has just been collapse. Right? It's part of why I'm so drawn to some of the things you're writing.
Yeah.
Is that's all I've ever seen. I mean, LTV Steel collapsed when I was in high school, and that was pretty much the end.
Okay.
Yeah, and
so you've been in like the kind of the light cone of deindustrialization ever since.
Yeah, pretty much. And you could even see it starting when I was young, right? So starting in like, my case was the early 80s, but about 10 years before that with the oil crisis, we really started seeing things go downhill here.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. And so I came up in that world of economic stagnation and then collapse.
Okay.
And so, but I think it's, one of the things that this points out, though, is like we all have our stories, and they're all fascinating stories. They're all different stories, and they're all fascinating stories. I know maybe 2 or 3 other people who have a background like mine, and that's it. Most of the other people I know came out of like evangelical Christian families or, just normie suburban families, like whatever, right? Like there's not a lot of that connection, unfortunately, to the movements of the past, which we really need in order to inform the things that we're doing today. It's critical. It's maybe one of the most critical things.
Desperate to reinvigorate. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And that is in large part the project of the book, which I'm going to get to in a second. But, so to your point, and particularly about the point about finding a box full of old magazines that you turn out to have a connection to, it turns out, so the book is called Lifehouse. And I'll get into this in more detail, but the fundamental proposition of the book is that we have to organize these neighborhood scale disaster relief and recovery hubs, but they're quite a bit more than that. They're places that are designed to offer us shelter and refuge from the ordinary insults of late capitalism, as well as the insults of the climate crisis. And the deep irony is at the very end of this project, a friend of mine sent me, it turns out that in the meantime, the Whole Earth had digitized their entire archives. They are
Did they really?
On archive.org.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And so a friend of mine who's been doing like a deep dive into this sends me this link. He's like, well, surely you must have known about this. I'm like, what? Known about what? He's like, it's your proposition. It's even called the Lifehouse. It's in like, this footnote of the 1969 edition.
Oh my God.
Yeah. It's crazy. And so not only is it really, really important to maintain a vital connection to the past, and here is a place where I do feel that network information technology has made a big difference in our ability to do that and not rely on crates full of, mouse shit and gnawed upon old fanzines. But it was so painful to read this and to realize that I had reinvented the wheel, right? And that there are aspects to my proposition that are novel, but the emotional core of it was articulated in 1969 and even had the same name. And so, I think this says a couple of things. I think it says primarily that we'd be in a much better position now if we had done what these people in 1969 were suggesting we do. And so I'm kind of hoping that collectively we undertake the project that I'm proposing we undertake in the book together, with the idea that maybe if we do, we'll be in a better situation 40 years from now. And also just by way of observing and really putting some respect on, all of the efforts of the people who've come before us, without whose efforts we probably wouldn't even be able to articulate. We wouldn't be able to have the conversation we're having. Yeah. We wouldn't have the language to have it in. We would always have a language, but the specific terms and ideas, so many of it, it's not novel to me. It's not novel to the book. It's things that I've soaked up from respectful attention to other times and places in history. And so that is the project of the book, right? Is to disinter those experiences and hopefully bring them to life. So what is this book, right? What is this? Why am I on your show? Why have you had me on your show? After Occupy Sandy, after I had that experience, the idea lay fallow for a couple of years. I wasn't in dialogue with anybody that was interested in these sorts of things. And frankly, after the crisis of Sandy passed, very much against my expectation, my perhaps naive expectation, New York City went back to New York Citying. Just like we've now seen again after the pandemic lockdown, late capitalism has this ferocious way of reasserting itself, even, in the wake of what you would regard as pretty significant disruption. It just kind of picked up, resumed your previously scheduled broadcast right where it had left off. And all of the energy that I thought was going to go into a horizontally organized, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal way of being in the world in New York City didn't really happen. Yeah. But the idea kind of stayed with me. And then, the pandemic and the lockdown happened. And again, one of the most effective modes of response was autonomous local mutual aid popping up spontaneously. And I really began to see that there was a longer historical arc to what I was talking about. It wasn't simply about response to crisis, but it was a response to the meta crisis, to the larger rhythm of collapse that you experienced in your lifetime, that I've seen in my lifetime, and that really just kind of seems to be picking up pace. And this is something that I think of as the long emergency. And the long emergency to me isn't simply global heating. It is the second and third order consequences of, enormously destructive weather events and the withdrawal of insurers from insuring commercial real estate against those events. And, ultimately there was, the withdrawal of the state for some of the things that it previously took responsibility for, its disappearance from our lives, and the necessity of us organizing ourselves in response to that. So if this is now the fundamental grounding circumstance of our existence together, how do we begin building structures that might see us through? And so I began to look back in time and across space, and I found amazing examples of things like the Black Panther survival programs, of things like the Common Ground mutual aid effort in New Orleans, which I think pretty much directly inspired Occupy Sandy, that happened after Hurricane Katrina. The Greek solidarity networks after the crisis in Greece in 2011. And even things so those things felt to me like they were about care, but they all kind of delaminated at some point. I mean, the Black Panthers most obviously, because they were the target of really extreme repression by the United States and local governments. The Greek solidarity networks, because they were co-opted in some ways by a putatively left-wing government, which kind of took on some of the effort and then I would regard them as having betrayed that effort by having, in technology, we would say embrace, extend, and extinguish. We used to say that's what Microsoft would do to technology companies that they were buying. And to me, that's what the Syriza government did to the anarchist efforts, the local clinics and the local pharmacies and the local kitchens. It absorbed, it embraced, it extended, and it exterminated those things. So I began looking at ways, if these care efforts are to survive, what do they need to do? Well, they need to achieve local power. Mm-hmm. And so the next chapter of the book is, how do you do that? How do you claim local power sufficient to articulate in the world a network of mutual aid-driven, mutual care-driven programs to protect them, to give them space, to allow them to breathe? And so I looked at things like Spanish municipalism and most triumphantly, most interesting to me, the experience of Rojava, where, after 2014, by some reckonings up to the present moment, I really regard sort of the classic period of high Rojava as being 2014 to November 2019. Mm-hmm. But, a society on the scale of a state, so, up to about 5 million human beings at times, organizing itself on non-state principles, organizing itself on ecofeminist, on anarchist principles, organizing itself on really very profound values, and doing so in the middle of a grievously bloody conflict, the Syrian civil war, and the fight against what the West knows as ISIS and what they would know as Daesh. In this kind of crucible of absolutely bloody interstate conflict where the local factions of Syria were used as puppets by state actors from outside. And, so the people, what is now called the Autonomous Administration of Northeastern Syria, but we more generally call it Rojava, these people managed to do anarchy at a very large scale for a very long time with very good results. And so that becomes the next chapter of the book, like collective power. And then all of these things culminate in the proposition that gives the book its name, the Lifehouse, a chapter on the Lifehouse. Like, what if you organized in every neighborhood, in every city, in every town, in every community, every 2 or 3 blocks, there was a physical place you could go to that would protect you from the effects of climate change, that would be off grid, would be able to, power itself, would be able to run medical devices for the people that needed them, would be able to purify water, would be able to possibly even grow a little bit of food, and in general would physically and psychically sustain people against the insults, as I said, not merely of a world where all bets are off in terms of what the atmosphere is doing, but also the ordinary everyday insults that we're intimately familiar with because we've been on the coalface of late capitalism. And we know what that feels like.
Well, and to put another historical marker there, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things that I picked up on when I was reading the text, and you mentioned this, but the idea of the kind of hub for a community to be able to have its needs met is a thing which, I mean, we have roots in doing these kinds of things in the United States, especially in the Rust Belt, right? Like where I grew up in the city I live in, they were called community houses and they still exist, a lot of them. And they were there for like everything from teaching people how to read all the way up to getting them food and clothes and medical care, right? And like everything else in the middle at a time when, most of the population of the city was living in like grinding poverty, even more so than now. And just how core and how central those institutions are still to whole communities 100 years later, right? Because they fulfill a need that capitalism can't. And they do it in a way that's empowering, right?
That's right.
And that, I mean, there's a lot of the projects I've personally been involved in locally have been very inspired by that for these exact reasons, right? And I think there's a number of things that kind of come up here that I want to sort of hone in on for the last half an hour that we have that have to do with some of the implications of what's being said, right? So like one of the more controversial claims in some circles, and this is controversial in the sense that like whenever people talk about irreversible collapse, you always get pushback, right? I generally face that as well a lot of the time. But one of the more controversial claims that's made, and one that I have a lot of affinity towards, is the idea that the situation that we're in now, currently, ecologically, politically, economically, is not, even if one would want to, salvageable, right? That it's so far beyond gone. I think you put it like we had crossed many red lines at this point, right? Like many points of no return, many thresholds. You know, we're living in a world which most of the infrastructure on the planet's been built since 1945 and isn't able to be sustained with the amount of resources we have, right? So that really realigns a lot of things politically, right? And I think a couple of the things I want to kind of talk about really quickly are, first, one of the things that came to mind was how this sort of a reading evokes a conversation that we had where I live 4 or 5 years ago, where someone from Mutual Aid Disaster Relief came through and we were talking about disaster response. And someone raised their hand and went, how do we tell the difference between a disaster and a not disaster? Which was a really great question, right? Especially living in the place where I live, where there's murders and people starve, and you know it's bad. It's an incredibly poor American city. How do you tell the difference, right? And I think one of one of the things that's happening in this text is a disruption of that separation, right? But I think secondly, that's the other thing that's happening is this sort of pushback against the concept that political work is there to conserve or save something. Right, which is sort of an idea that comes out of the environmentalist movement, but it's one that sort of saturates a lot of political discourse. And so what do you think that the implications of that are? I mean, like, that's two things to move beyond that are like relatively significant in the way that people understand their sort of relationship to what they're doing.
Yeah. The first thing, you know, I think that's a really pointed question. It's really welcome, because anytime you invoke the idea of a disaster, the thing that sort of falls by the wayside, it's such an overwhelming idea that I think people forget to ask, well, disaster for who or for what, really?
Yeah. Right.
You know, it's become in some quarters almost a cliche by now to invoke the idea that the thing that we've done to the atmosphere, you know, barring the really bad runaway greenhouse effect scenario where you get Venus on the other end of it, which I think is pretty much, you know, unambiguously a disaster for everything. There are any number of scenarios that, you know, are alternately bad for the current ruling class or bad for some relatively privileged sector of humanity, or bad for the entire human species, but not the other species on the planet. There are all kinds of scenarios that are, you know, there's a lot of violence in them. There's a lot of kinetic energy in them, but they might very well represent sets of conditions in which other things can thrive. So I think something that I do need to be explicit about is, you know, who are the sets of circumstances that we're now having to contend with a disaster for. I don't think it's simply that they're a disaster for CEOs. I think, you know, I'm very sensitive to the argument that, you know, we might as well call this the capitalocene because capital, you know, it's capital that created this. But I do think it's going to be really hard for all of us, and not merely all of us in the global north, and not merely all of us who, you know, currently enjoy privileged positions within the global north. I mean, all of humanity. There is a larger enclosing, there are many larger enclosing circles to that. You know, I have to confess on some level, I'm not a doomer, I'm a Taoist. And so, you know, I really, at the ultimate last call, end of the day, my sorrow is that the kinds of relations that I've grown up around will become impossible. That the particular sets of experiences and structures of relations that I grew up around and have nostalgia for, you know, are going to be rendered completely impossible. And I'm very clear about that. You know, just hanging out with people, having conversations that are not charged with the freighted weight of everything that we're living through, having, you know, in that sense, the privilege to have kind of an unambitious, unproductive, not particularly dramatic life, you know, that's out the window. The people who say, you know, okay, so what? This is how people have always lived under pressure. This is how 8/10 of humanity or more have always lived. Get over yourself. I think there's justice to that. right? And I admit that. And, they're not wrong. It's just this is a disaster that I'm experiencing as such. The other question, which is very closely related to this, is about resilience. And in the book, one of the things that I pick up on is a discourse that I first heard being offered maybe around 2013, 2014, which is that, we had the discourse of sustainability for a long time. And early in the 21st century, it became evident that not a damn thing we're doing is sustainable in any way. And so what is the discourse that replaces sustainability? And that discourse came to be known as resilience. And particularly even after Occupy Sandy, there's this thing called the Special Initiative for Resilience and Recovery in New York City. People to this day talk about, oh, your book is about resilience hubs. And I'm like, well, no, it's not. Why is that? Because resilience, as we are now increasingly hearing, means the capacity of a system to return itself to the status quo ante after some disruptive event has happened. And it took, a couple of years of people being told this for a lot to, it to sort of sink in on a more widespread level. But the system that we now experience, that we now live with, that we now contend with, is not just, does not deserve to be restored, deserves to be transcended. Mm-hmm. And, this is in some ways the argument of a really interesting book called Anthropocene Back Loop. Experiments in Unsafe Operating Space by a woman named Stephanie Wakefield. And her argument is like, okay, well, it was never something that we should have even countenanced trying to restore or recover or protect or defend. We now have an unparalleled opportunity to reinvent all of the fundamental conditions of our existence. I mean, really, a lot is up for grabs now. And let's make the most of that and not settle for these really kind of epistemically weak claims, like, okay, well, we're going to, keep the power on and we're going to, make sure that people have access to like ongoing supplies of insulin, but we're not going to do anything about the reasons why things got so fucked up in the first place. That's crazy to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the Democratic Party's proposal, right? Essentially is let's deal with the, fallouts of capitalism without actually dealing with capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah. And you see this, from across the political spectrum in a variety of different guises, but they're essentially like, these are extraordinarily conservative propositions. The Green New Deal to me is nonsensical to talk about, with all due respect to the people I know and care about who are, very motivated by that language. Good industrial jobs working on the solarization of late capitalism, is it better than what we have now? Marginally, but when everything is up for grabs, why settle for the marginal?
Well, and I guess the question, as we're seeing with the actual effects of solar panel production, it doesn't necessarily make the situation any less disastrous. That's, in the immediate sense, right? Like and this is kind of, it's sort of like if you want to be ecological, you live in a LEED certified building, right? Which is going to be new, meaning you just tore something down and built something new to be ecological, right? Like that's so much of how that discourse plays itself out. It's based in these kinds of sort of reductions of the general global situation to individual acts, right? As opposed to understanding it systemically. And I think one of the things that's really changed, that's become really a kind of sea change in the way that we're starting to see things. And it's similar to, we were recording the podcast with Eric King recently, and we were talking about the CEO shooting. And one of the things I said is that one of the things the CEO shooting exposed, interestingly, is a sort of realignment of what people consider to be self-defense, right? That the way that people are talking about this is as self-defense against a person who carried out mass societal violence. And normally that mass societal violence is considered legitimate and therefore not something to defend yourself against. But that is what has changed, right? Is like that is the shift in the discourse. And I see something similar happening with the idea of what we consider to be normality and disaster, where these kinds of breakdowns, and this was talked about in a really brilliant article about Sri Lanka. I'm forgetting the author's name off the top of my head, but these kinds of disasters, these sorts of collapses don't appear necessarily as anomalies, but they actually appear as a slow shifting of what normality means. And so the way that it was discussed in Sri Lanka is it's like, you go to work in the morning and you go out at night, and then you wake up and you hear a news story about like there being a bombing somewhere, and then, go to work again and you go grocery shopping, you come back, you hear another story about there being a firefight somewhere. And that's just how it is. Every once in a while you see the effects of it, but most of the time you're kind of living in this situation which is degrading almost imperceptibly until it's not imperceptible anymore, which is kind of the way that people talked about the fall of the Soviet Union, right? That it was, impossible until it was inevitable. And there's this kind of sense to that. And I think one of the questions I have is, how do we address that? Like, how do we deal with that without allowing those things to become normality, right? Without allowing disaster to just become acceptable as the situation that we find ourselves in, but without also falling into the other discourse of trying to save what exists to stop the disasters from happening, right? It's a difficult space to end up in.
It's really challenging, and my only way of addressing that is equally complicated. It's sort of a multi-part maneuver. I think we have to preempt disaster, and I think we have to preempt disaster by living prefiguratively, right? I mean, this is the wonderful thing, is that so many of the theoretical tools and practical experiences of movement and community in the last 20 years kind of already prepare us for this. They're right at hand. We have to live prefiguratively. In this particular context, that involves what would ordinarily be thought of as prepperism.
Yeah.
And so one of the struggles around this book and the set of ideas that we're discussing is, how do we retrieve some very, very valid, very valuable, life-critical information from the paranoia, from the racism and the xenophobia and the fear of the other that it's generally bound up with, from the machismo that it's generally bound up with, from the affect and the aesthetics that it's generally bound up with. Can these things be disentangled? And, I believe they can be. I just think that it takes people doing the work. And so that's one of the challenges that I've set myself. I think that if we organize ourselves cellularly, as communities, as neighborhood scale assemblies, making real dispositive, basically having deliberative control over actual resource, right? So that the assemblies are dispositive of actual resource in the world. And if this becomes more of the way we live our lives more of the time, all of a sudden the disaster, when and as it happens, and it's already happening, doesn't have that, that extended, that infinitely drawn out and then all at once quality to it, right? The dynamic is shifted completely. What you need to do is, and here's where it's difficult for people with politics like ours, because I don't believe in vanguardism, right? I don't believe in getting too far out ahead of people. I think the idea that I use isn't leadership, or certainly isn't vanguardism, but it is initiative. You have to take the initiative, and you have to begin modeling these ways of survival and thriving, which I believe will become quite mainstream. And I think that they'll become mainstream because there will not be any other way to do this. Right. And I think the degree to which we model and practice and live those things, nothing that happens afterward takes us by surprise. The infrastructure's already there. The physical infrastructure's there, the social infrastructure's there. And in a way, this is exactly what Occupy Sandy did, with Occupy Wall Street. Like, the network was there. It was stood up immediately. So just make the networks now, forge the networks now. And the thing is, you're doing this. Literally, by doing this podcast, you're doing the work.
Yeah.
You're beginning to have conversations with the people that you're going to need to have as part of your network. I know, maybe you have, and maybe you haven't made this explicit in the context of this podcast. I know that you personally have a lot of the skills that I would certainly want to have access to, in untoward situations. We begin by spreading this knowledge, and by reducing Because do you know what I think makes people make bad decisions is fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think when you're all up in your fear, you make bad decisions as individuals and you make bad decisions as societies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think like what helps with fear is practice, is drilling, is kind of living with the incipient reality of something until it no longer scares you because you know exactly what you're going to do and who you're going to do it with when it eventuates.
Right.
And so this is the mission.
Yeah, and I think, we're going to have definitely an episode we're going to talk about to Margaret Killjoy at some point in the future about prepping as well. Because Margaret also has...
ask her about her black metal band.
Oh, definitely. Oh, yeah. No, that's coming up. And so is the electronic band that's absolutely coming up too.
Outstanding.
But Margaret has a lot of really interesting thoughts about this. And I know we've talked about this kind of, not during this recording, but one of the really difficult things about the idea of prepperism in the United States, very specifically, is that it is so deeply tied in with a notion of sort of, the isolated individual at war with the world, right? That you need to get as far outside of everything, as far away from everybody else as you possibly can with as much guns and ammo as possible and just lock yourself down in a bunker and come out 10 years later, right?
100%.
That's generally how it's thought. And it is a deeply problematic understanding of what that means for a lot of reasons, but it also flies completely in the face of human experience, right?
No, that's right.
And in the communities...
No, empirically, that's...
Yeah. In the communities I grew up in, that's how people survive. That's how you get food. That's what happens when you don't have a job. You rely on your neighbors, right?
Yes.
And somehow, though there's a very long history of that, even in the United States, that is not how we think about these things. And so I think maybe a good question, a couple questions to sort of close on is, first, how do we get people to start thinking in our circles? To start thinking about things in this way, to get past, there's a similar conversation around gun culture too, to get past the right-wing connotations, to get past all of the machismo and militarism and all of that, and understand that you are learning to use a tool, right? And getting through the demystification part. How do you think we can do that most effectively in relation to things like this? Because it is so deeply bound up with so much of the culture war stuff that happens in the US right now.
So much to say about that. One thing, I'm going to go way out on a limb here. This is just a conjecture. It may be that some of the culture war stuff is beginning to die down a little bit. And I think this might be a silver lining of some of the reversals that
that's interesting.
Broadly progressive forces have experienced I don't want to get into electoral politics or whether what happened in November was, a defeat or, I personally do regard it as one of the worst people I've ever met, kind of becoming more and more powerful. And just the worst people in the world doing their little touchdown end zone dance is just really, unattractive. But let's put that to the side. Let me just, for the sake of argument, let's just say that was a real reversal and a real injury for anybody who believes in justice and anybody who has a soul. And I say that with all due respect. I know there are people who, have been living in a lot of pain, and this was, voting for the eventual victor was their way of giving vent to some of that pain. But I we'll just leave that to the side for a second. I think one of the silver linings of that experience is that there is a discursive space that's open that is in some ways the experience of defeat and of recognizing that whatever it was that we were doing didn't work. And there may be some people who conclude from that, well, we should have, we should double down. We should do that harder. We should just go, just absolutely, no pun intended, guns blazing. And, but for me, it was some of the language, particularly some of the stances that we took, managed to strongly give voice to the experience and perspectives of people who have never been listened to, and that is right and proper and just, and I don't believe that we should retreat from that at all, but that we failed to have the kind of conversation that could bring people into those perspectives. It's my personal opinion now, and I think there may be just a little bit more patience now and sorrowful reflection about, well, what might work if that didn't.
Yeah.
And I hope, I have very many strong existential beliefs, that separate me from other people. But I really, particularly in mutual aid, that like you need, it's all hands on deck. You really need everybody to be there, and you need access to all of the energy and all the skill and all the ingenuity that people have. And so one of the things I'm really interested in the book is invitationality, which is not quite the same thing as radical inclusivity. It's different in a nuanced way. Invitationality is like, how do you make sure that people feel comfortable and welcome in these spaces of mutual care that I'm talking about putting together? And it means really just a minimal commitment to treating other people with dignity.
It's funny how far that goes, right? Like treating people with basic respect and dignity. Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how far that goes.
Yeah. Like, so I'm not even necessarily asking, like, what you do outside of this space, but when you're in this space, if you cannot agree to treat the people around you with respect and dignity, then you're not welcome in this space.
Absolutely.
And I think that from that, you can begin to knit relations outward. One of my kind of culture heroes and a good friend, she's become a good friend, is Kim Kelly.
Oh yeah, Kim's great.
The amazing metal journalist and labor activist.
Yes, best metal journalist ever, by the way, if all of y'all don't know that. Kim was an amazing,
she's fantastic,
amazing metal reviewer, like back in the day. Oh my God.
Yeah, no, I first came, to know her as Grim Kim.
Oh yeah.
And so her latter day career as a labor archivist and journalist has been kind of extraordinary to watch. But she talks a lot about, working with in unionizing, with folks who are Trumpists, or who are, evangelical, or who are, they have opinions and beliefs that are upsetting to her. And she's like, you know what? We have a fight on our hands now that needs all of us if we're going to prevail. And, let us not suppress our differences, but let's take that off the table for now. Let's win this victory, and then we can get into the things which divide us, and hopefully do that from the perspective of people who have won some victories together and maybe developed some appreciation for one another. And I do not believe that she's naive. There's kind of a liberal kumbaya version of that, and I don't think that's what she's peddling, right? And I really take a lot of inspiration from that. I think that, particularly for people in the States, collective survival will require developing relationships with people who have beliefs who are different from yours.
Yes. I think it's
not
one of
just
the lessons,
going to be anarchists.
Yeah, it's one of the lessons you learn in the Rust Belt a lot when you're doing organizing here, is that you end up organizing in situations with a lot of people with a lot of problems, and that do, not always the best stuff. And you have to learn to deal with those people as people in a situation that's real, right? And not as sort of like symbols who broke a moral rule or something like that. It's a lot more complicated. Like, real communities are not spaces of moral simplicity, right?
Yeah. And I think we kind of, again, this is just me, shooting my mouth off, but, I think we let that moral simplicity guide. It was founded in genuine and legitimate rage, but it guided us to places that were not functional. And I hope that we were able collectively to come back from some of that. So for me, what that means is trying to decouple a lot of things which I think are really healthy and positive from things which I think are deeply inimical. So for example, I'll give you an example that's just, it jumps out at me every day because I live in the UK. It turns out that when crises happen, people in the States take initiative. They do what they need to do. And weirdly, I think that it's because in the settler colonialist DNA, that rugged self-reliance that is so deeply and profoundly unhelpful, at least means you don't wait around for the state to come to your assistance. Right. It at least means that you understand that you're on your own. What I'd like is for our understanding of what it means to be on your own, to be a collective one and not kind of a clannish, small family group, armored bunker based one. But here, in the UK, when something terrible happens, the first recourse, very ordinarily, even among people of pretty significantly anti-authoritarian politics, is to wait for the council to do it, the local government.
Interesting.
This is crazy.
Weird.
I was at a municipalist workshop here, and the scenario was one of flooding, which, increasingly happens here due to the rains that we have now, which are, just unprecedented in the experience of anyone now living. And the scenario was like, you are a local assembly, an autonomous local assembly for a village that has received a weather forecast that flooding is going to begin in the next 48 hours. What does your assembly do? And, there's a lot of discussion. And then midway through the exercise, the moderators were like, well, guess what? The storm is here. The community has started to flood in a matter of a quarter hour. What does your assembly do now? And I cannot tell you how surreal it was for the conversation at that point to be like, well, we negotiate power sharing with the local council, and we see what we're allowed to do and what they, what they'll let us do. And, other people were like, well, I don't know why we would have an assembly now in the moment of maximum danger. And I'm like, dude, this is not a hypothetical. I mean, this is how Occupy Sandy did things. This is how, this is how generally mutual aid communities do things. Yes. This is not just a talking shop. This is how decisions are made and resources are allocated. And this is how communities respond. And mind you, this was a group of people who were explicitly self-selected and gathered to discuss municipalism, libertarian municipalism, like the anarchist version. Yeah. It blew my mind. So, let's just be thankful that in the States, for all of the things that we contend with, including, both everything that comes as a consequence of having a gun culture, at the very least, people are primed to take care of themselves. Mm-hmm. They don't wait. Mm-hmm. They don't sit in place and wait for the council to rescue them. And I think that is a material to work with. Yeah.
So why don't we end with, kind of the question I end a lot of interviews with. What does that mean for us now? So we're coming into a moment in which the future political situation in the US is incredibly precarious, I guess would be the nice word for it. The world is on fire and it feels like everything's burning down, right? And so we're, we're kind of in this, we're in the slow tail before everything happens all at once. And I know that a lot of the sense that I've been getting amongst people I know is that they're kind of falling into one of two categories, right? One is people that have just been like, well, I'm done. I'm just going to rest for the next 6 months and I guess we'll see where we're at. And then there's people who are doing the let's build mesh nets. Let's start stockpiling supplies. Let's start, which is a very different way of approaching that kind of a situation. And it's one which is grounded so much more in the idea that, and this is kind of how my community is approaching this, right? Which is, how I can speak about this with some level of information. But, the idea where I'm at is political activism is grounded in complaint, right? Complaining at people. And that's not a form of politics I personally engage in, but right now that's not a form of politics that's even viable for those that want to engage in it, because the people that you'd be complaining at literally declared war on you and do not care. They are antagonistic forces. And so that makes the structure of protest irrelevant, right, in this moment. And I think it's kind of pointing out a lot of the shortcomings of the idea of protest in liberal democracy. But that's made a lot of people
1,000,000%.
Yeah. And this is definitely a topic of a thing I'm going to write about at some point soon. But a lot of people are kind of lost in that situation right now, right? They don't really know what to do. They don't really know how to break out of the norms of activism that they've been sort of, brought into as part of their political development. They might not be in a place where there's a whole community of people. I'm very lucky to be in a city with a lot of anarchists in it, and a lot of us gather in one spot and we can sort of organize things like this. But for other people, for people that are outside of these communities, for people that live in rural Tennessee, for someone who's the one anarchist they know in their weird suburb or whatever, right? What can people like this do to sort of start the process of getting the conditions together for something like this, right? Because like one of the most damaging outcomes of American capitalism is the way that it isolates us, right? And that it keeps us away from collective understanding of ourselves and who we are in the communities that we're in. And overcoming that is a major problem. And so how can we sort of help or encourage, or what should we be telling people that are trying to sort of create the conditions to create something like this going forward?
So something that I derive from my understanding of like chaos and complexity theory, like the dynamics of and behavior of complex systems, is that, you know, in any situation of turbulence where it's kind of unclear what basin of possibility you're going to wind up in, the best strategy you can possibly adopt is a strategy that pays rewards no matter what possibility you wind up in. And so to me, that counsels things like developing the knowledge base, you know, that you're talking about. It you know, consists in forging relations with your neighbors, no matter how tentative or uncomfortable that might be. You know, in getting as fit as you possibly can, whatever that means for you. And there's another whole conversation there about, you know, extracting the idea of fitness from ableism and, you know, toxic masculinity and all the other nonsense that it's mired in. I think that if you are somebody who is capable and knows how to do things and exists within relations, no matter what happens, you will find yourself with something productive and valued to do. I think that to the degree that people are hearing your words, they're probably already at least liminally aware of some of the networks that might help them connect to people who share more of their beliefs and values than maybe their immediate neighbors. But I always say, you know, the most radical thing you can do is literally go and knock on your neighbor's door and introduce yourself. And you know, again, there's kind of a liberal kumbaya version of this. And there's, you know, I don't necessarily mean that everybody bringing sugar to each other's door is going to stave off some really bad things. You know, you might, it's uncomfortable. Yeah. It's uncomfortable to be, you know, to cross that threshold of intimacy with people that, you know, you might have good reason to fear. I get that. And I think that it's worth attending to the experiences of people, you know, like those, you know, in the immediate example I always go to is the Bosnian War, but there are examples from every period of history where, you know, guess what? It's your neighbor that actually poses the biggest threat to you. I think none of this is without risk. None of this is without nuance. None of this, you should certainly never do anything that, you know, trust your instincts about safety, and certainly don't open yourself up to people who mean you harm. But to the degree that it's safe for you to do so, there is literally nothing that you can do that will better prepare you for a wider range of outcomes, no matter what comes, than getting to know the people around you. Because it is going to be those people who you depend on and who depend on you when it happens.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
And you've been listening to The
Thanks
Beautiful Idea. Do you have anything you want to plug before we sign off?
You know what? Not really. I mean, I think like it's weird. Like I would love it if people read the book. I hope that they would find it meaningful and enjoyable. But you know, they'll find their way to it or not. You know, for the folks that are listening to this, if anything I've said makes sense, the book is called Lifehouse: Taking Care of Ourselves in a World on Fire. It's on Verso Books, and it's available in, you know, wherever better progressive books are sold. How did that? You know, that's a plug, right?
Yeah, that's
I've learned plug. The language of pluggery from late capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, thank you for listening to The Beautiful Idea. We will be back soon with more conversation. Anything you want to say before you sign off?
Thank you and take care. Be well, be safe, be healthy, and really consider introducing yourself to the people around you. It's very powerful.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone, and we will be back soon.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.